The end of the Crusader dream, the year was 1291. For almost 2 centuries, the cross had stood against the crescent on the burning sands of the Holy Land. Kingdoms had risen and fallen, kings had sworn oaths and broken them, and rivers of blood had soaked the stones of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli. Now, all that remained of that once glorious dream of Christendom in the east was a single city, Acre. Acre was no ordinary city. It was the beating heart of the Crusader states, a fortress of commerce, faith, and war. Within its walls, gold from Venice mixed with relics from Jerusalem. The banners of every great order, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and above all, the Templars, fluttered in the Mediterranean wind. Merchants from Genoa and Pisa haggled in its crowded markets. Priests sang in Latin beneath Gothic arches. And soldiers, hardened by a lifetime of battle, stood guard over the last gate of the Christian world in the east. But beyond the walls, a new power was rising. To the south, in the land once ruled by the pharaohs, the Mamluk Sultanate had become the undisputed master of the Muslim world. Born from slave soldiers, the Mamluks were forged for war. They had crushed the Mongols at Ain Jalut, driven the Crusaders from every stronghold except Acre. And now, their Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, had sworn that not a single Frankish stone would remain standing in his dominion. The Templars knew what was coming. They had seen it before, cities falling, comrades crucified, the Holy Land slipping away inch by inch. And yet, they stayed. Not because of gold, nor glory, but because Acre was more than a city. It was a promise, the last remnant of a vow sworn before God himself. In the great fortress of the temple, a citadel of white stone rising above the harbour, Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu looked out toward the horizon. He saw the sails of ships carrying pilgrims, merchants, and refugees westward, away from the coming storm. But he did not move, for the Templar creed was simple: to defend the faith until death. The warnings began in the early months of that fateful year. Scouts rode back from the plains of Galilee, their horses foaming, their faces pale. They spoke of armies gathering, tens of thousands of Mamluk warriors, siege engines, and sappers marching north under the Sultan's banner. By April, the enemy host appeared before the walls of Acre, a living sea of steel and banners stretching beyond the ice reach. The drums of war began to beat, deep and rhythmic, echoing across the plains like thunder. Inside the city, the defenders braced themselves. There were perhaps 12,000 soldiers in Acre, knights, sergeants, crossbowmen, and armed pilgrims. Among them, the proudest and most disciplined were the Knights Templar. Their fortress overlooked the harbour, its walls thicker than any in Christendom, its towers built for war. But even they could sense it. This time, there would be no reinforcements. No King Richard, no great crusade, no salvation from the West. The world had changed. Europe was tired of holy wars, and the Holy Land was tired of waiting. The Templars gathered in their chapel on the eve of the siege. No speeches were needed. Each man knew the meaning of what was to come. Acre would not fall easily, but it would fall. And yet, as the candles flickered on their iron helmets and mail, not one knight left his post. In silence, they took communion. In silence, they fastened their swords. And in silence, they waited for dawn. That dawn, the dawn of April 5th, 1291, broke red. The Mamluk banners rose with the sun, and the first arrows darkened the sky. Acre, the jewel of the Crusader East, was now the anvil upon which the fate of the Templar Order would be forged. The gathering storm and the city of Acre. The drums did not stop. Day and night, the ground trembled beneath the march of the Mamluk host. The air was filled with the deep hum of their chants, the clatter of armor, and the shrieks of beasts of burden pulling siege engines. Monstrous towers of timber and iron, catapults capable of hurling stones heavier than a man. Acre's defenders watched from the walls. Some whispered prayers, others cursed beneath their breath. But the Templars, they were silent. They had seen many sieges, but none like this. The scale was beyond imagination. From the sea, Acre seemed invincible. Its walls rose in layers, an inner city fortified by bastions, and beyond it, the double curtain of outer defenses. The harbour bristled with ships, Venetian galleys, Genoese cogs, and the sleek black vessels of the Templar fleet. But from the landward side, where the plains stretched wide and open, the enemy came like an ocean of death. Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil himself oversaw the preparations. He had inherited not only the throne of Egypt, but also the dream of his father, Calawan, who had vowed to drive the Franks into the sea. Now, standing beneath the banner of the Prophet, Khalil raised his hand, and 1,000 trumpets sounded. The The siege of Acre had begun. The first days were a storm of fire. Massive stones crashed against the walls, splintering battlements and crushing defenders beneath showers of debris. The catapults hurled jars of burning oil that exploded on impact, turning towers into infernos. The Mamluks pushed forward great wooden mantlets and siege towers, each one covered in hides soaked in vinegar to resist flame. From the ramparts, the defenders responded with their own fury. Crossbow bolts hissed through the air, finding eyes and throats. The great trebuchets of the city, God stones, as they were called, hurled back their deadly weight. One by one, Mamluk engines were shattered, their crews torn apart in blasts of dust and splinters. And in the midst of it all, the Templars fought like men possessed. Their discipline was unmatched. Each dawn, the brothers took to their stations in perfect order. No shouts, no confusion. The red cross upon their surcoats shone through the dust and smoke like a symbol of defiance. Guillaume de Beaujeu, their Grand Master, rode along the inner wall, encouraging his men not with words, but with presence. He was no longer young, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had carried him through decades of war. He knew the truth. The city could not be saved, but it could be remembered. For nearly a month, Acre held. The harbour became a chaos of ships, some bringing supplies, others fleeing with women and children. Inside the city, life and death coexisted. In one street, bakers still sold bread, priests still offered mass, and children still laughed, unaware of the doom beyond the walls. In another, bodies lay in heaps, the stench of rot mixing with the salt wind. The Mamluks encircled the city completely. Their camp was like a moving city, tens of thousands of tents, banners of green and gold, the shimmer of curved blades in the sunlight. They had time, numbers, and faith on their side. The Franks had only walls and will. By mid-May, the outer defences were failing. Entire sections of the walls were reduced to rubble. The defenders fought not from the battlements but from the ruins, turning every breach into a killing ground. The Templars, along with the Hospitallers and the remnants of the king's troops, counterattacked in daring sorties. They struck fast, scattering enemy engineers, then vanished back into the smoke. But each counterattack cost lives, precious lives. The ranks of the Templars thinned. Many who had sworn their vows in France, England, and the Rhineland now lay beneath the sands of Palestine, their blood mingling with the stones of Acre. Then came the Great Assault. At dawn on May 18, 1291, the Mamluks launched their final storming of the city. Trumpets sounded, and the horizon erupted with motion. Ladders, siege towers, and waves of men in gleaming armor advancing under a black rain of arrows. The defenders met them with boiling oil, stones, and fire, but still they came. From the north wall, a cry rose. The tower of St. Anthony had fallen. The Mamluks poured through the breach, and suddenly the city was no longer a fortress but a battlefield. The streets became rivers of chaos. Knights fought shoulder to shoulder with townsmen, priests with daggers in their hands. Smoke filled the air, and the sound was unlike anything ever heard before. It was the end of a world. The Templars fell back to the inner line, the gate of the king's quarter, and beyond it, their citadel. Every street they abandoned was paved with corpses. But they did not retreat in panic. They fought in ranks, slow and deliberate, covering each other, as if the rules of battle still meant something in the face of annihilation. Grand Master de Beaujeu rode to the front, rallying those who still held the inner gate. Arrows struck his armor like hail. He raised his sword, shouting for his men to hold. And then, the blow came. A spear pierced beneath his arm, finding the gap in his mail. He did not fall immediately. He turned his horse, blood running down his side, and rode back toward the citadel. "I am not dead," he said to those who tried to support him, though his face was pale as marble. But moments later, his strength failed, and he was carried inside. The brothers gathered around him, but his eyes no longer saw them. The Grand Master of the Templars was dead, and outside, Acre was burning. The Mamluks surged forward, taking the outer city street by street. The Hospitallers were overrun at their commandery. The king's palace was set aflame. Ships in the harbour tried desperately to flee, colliding in panic as civilians stormed the quays. The screams of thousands filled the air. By nightfall, only one fortress still held, the temple itself. There, the last Templars made their stand. Behind the thick stone walls of their citadel, they gathered what remained of the Brotherhood. Wounded knights, exhausted sergeants, even children, all took refuge in the fortress by the sea. The Mamluks surrounded it, but they hesitated to attack. The Templar fortress was a monster of masonry. towers 30 meters high, walls thick enough to withstand any engine. Inside, the surviving brothers prepared for what they knew was the end. They lit torches along the battlements, the flames flickering like stars over the harbor. Below, the waves crashed against the breakwater, red with blood. And above, the night was silent, the silence that comes only after too much death. The siege of Acre was nearly over. But for the Templars, the real battle, the last battle, was only beginning. The siege, fire, steel, and despair. The temple fortress stood like a mountain above the ruins of Acre. Its towers were carved from white limestone, its walls a masterpiece of Crusader engineering, a labyrinth of gates, inner courtyards, and murder holes designed for one purpose: to make men pay in blood for every inch of ground. But that night, the fortress was no longer just a stronghold. It was a tomb. Inside, nearly 5,000 souls were trapped: knights, sergeants, townsfolk, and children. The Templars had opened their gates to all who could not flee. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and sweat, the flicker of torches dancing across faces hollow with fear. The body of Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu lay in the chapel, wrapped in the banner of the Order, a red cross on a white field. The brothers prayed beside him, their armor blackened from soot, their hands still trembling from battle. Each man knew his fate. Outside, the Mamluk army encircled the fortress. The Sultan's engineers moved forward under cover of night, bringing up mangonels and sappers. They dug trenches and built platforms, preparing for the final assault. The Sultan himself established his command near the ruins of the king's palace, from where he could see the Templar towers rise against the burning horizon. He had taken the city, but not yet the temple. And he knew, as did every man in his host, that to conquer this last bastion would not be a victory easily won. The next morning, the attack began. 1,000 drums rolled like thunder as the first wave of Mamluks advanced, their armor glinting in the dawn light. They came with ladders and grappling hooks, shouting praises to God. Arrows rained down upon them from the battlements, cutting through their ranks, but still they came. Atop the walls, the Templars fought with grim precision. They poured boiling oil and molten lead through murder holes. They hurled stones with their bare hands. Crossbow bolts struck faces and throats. Each knight fought not as a man defending life, but as a man already dead. Hour after hour, the battle raged. The Mamluks reached the base of the wall, scaling ladders only to be hurled back into the moat below. Catapults smashed against the towers, shaking the earth. Fire spread across the outer courtyard. The smell of burning wood, flesh, and tar filled the air. And yet, the fortress held. From the sea, the ships of the Venetians and Genoese watched helplessly. The harbor was choked with wrecks and smoke. A few captains, seeing the flames consume the city, tried to send small boats to the fortress, but the Mamluk archers filled the air with arrows. Only a handful reached the shore. Inside the citadel, water was running low. Food was scarce. The wounded lay in the lower halls, moaning in the dark. Templar chaplains moved among them, blessing those near death. Children cried for their mothers. The brothers shared their last bread and wine, their last prayers, their last hopes. By the third day, the outer walls of the fortress began to crumble. The Mamluks had tunneled beneath the foundations, packing the tunnels with wood and pitch. When they set them ablaze, the ground shook as if the earth itself cried out. A section of the southern wall collapsed, and the enemy surged forward. The Templars counterattacked with fury. Led by Peter de Sevres, Marshal of the Order, a handful of knights rode from the inner gate, cutting through the first wave of attackers. Their charge scattered the enemy, but they were too few. Surrounded and outnumbered, they fought until their horses fell, their swords breaking against shields. None returned. Still, the defenders refused to yield. The Mamluks offered terms, promises of mercy if the fortress surrendered. But the Templars did not answer. They had taken vows not to retreat, not to surrender, not to bow before the enemies of Christendom. As the days turned into nights, the fortress became a furnace of suffering. The stones glowed red from the heat of fires. The dead lay piled in corridors, unburied. And through it all, the chanting of the Templars could be heard, deep, rhythmic, unbroken. It was not defiance. It was devotion. Then, on the night of May 25th, the Mamluks launched their greatest assault. From every side, they came, tens of thousands, torches blazing like stars. Siege towers rolled forward, their wooden sides gleaming with firelight. Battering rams pounded the gates until they splintered. The roar of men and steel filled the night. Atop the walls, the Templars stood shoulder to shoulder. They had no strength left, but they had purpose. Each man fought until he fell. Their swords, nicked and bent, struck again and again. Blood ran down the steps of the keep, pooling at their feet. The Mamluks breached the first courtyard, then the second. The defenders fell back to the Great Hall, where the banner of the Order still hung from a ceiling. There, among the dead and dying, the last of the knights gathered. Peter de Sevry, bleeding from a dozen wounds, ordered the gates sealed. If the fortress was to fall, it would fall on their terms. When the Mamluks broke through, they found not cowards, but lions. The Templars met them blade to blade in the torchlight. Their white mantles turned crimson. Men fought until they could no longer stand, then dragged themselves across the floor to strike again. By dawn, the fighting had reached the inner keep, the very heart of the fortress. Hundreds of women and children had taken refuge there. Seeing that no escape remained, the surviving Templars made a grim decision. They sent envoys to the Sultan. The terms were desperate but clear. The Mamluks would be allowed to occupy the outer halls, but the brothers and civilians would be permitted to withdraw by sea. The Sultan, exhausted by the losses his army had suffered, agreed. For a moment, it seemed that mercy might triumph over vengeance. But treachery is the oldest companion of war. When the first Mamluk detachments entered the fortress to secure it, some among them, eager for plunder, began to loot and kill. Panic erupted. The Templars, seeing the slaughter of innocents, flew into a rage. They sealed the gates again, trapping the invaders inside. What followed was a massacre. In the narrow halls of the temple, steel clashed upon steel in darkness. The Templars fought with daggers, axes, even broken stones. Hundreds of Mamluks were cut down before they could retreat. Blood flooded the passageways. When the Sultan learned of the betrayal and the slaughter, his wrath was boundless. He ordered the fortress destroyed. Sappers packed the tunnels beneath the keep with powder and oil. The surviving brothers, no more than a few hundred, gathered in the chapel for the last time. They knew what was coming. As dawn rose over the smoking ruins of Acre, the ground shook with a deafening roar. The temple fortress, heart of the Order, last bastion of the Crusader dream, collapsed into itself. Stones, fire, and men were swallowed by the sea. The last battle of the Templars was over. Only silence remained, broken by the waves washing against the shattered harbour, and the cries of gulls circling above the ruins. Acre, the last city of the Crusaders, was no more. And with it, the dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land vanished forever.